Beware the tyranny of the straight line. Now think about what you see when you're walking in Back Bay in late spring and you're looking out at the Charles or looking out over Boston Harbor in the summer. You see lots of sailboats. And if you watch them skimming the whitecaps, you will notice something important. Sailboats do not glide through the water in a straight line. They tack. They zigzag from here to there. And that's how they move forward.
So, well, we weren't the first to think of the tacking concept. We wondered if that was just really well-intentioned advice from wise people, or if in fact leaders actually looked like that they really saw the tacks. And so what we did is, as Nora said, we built a database. So we were looking at prevalence of cross-sector affiliations, and let me define what we mean. A cross-sector affiliation is, so if we were looking at a public sector leader, had they worked in the private sector? A corporate leader or a private sector leader, we'd ask, did they serve on a nonprofit board, a public commission? Were they ever a nonprofit leader, et cetera? So any one of those experiences we would describe as a cross-sector affiliation. And here's what we found. So just looking at corporate leaders, 58% of them were just, quote, corporate leaders. We were not able to find any explicit cross-sector affiliations. The other 42%, though, about 30% had one or more nonprofit affiliations, 5% had public, and 8% had both public and private affiliations. So this is just off of our publicly available data. What we did learn as we talked to folks that we were always low. They always had affiliations that we were not able to find from our search of the public record. So I believe all these numbers are low, and I can't tell you by how much. We looked at those leaders of nonprofit organizations. 38% of them had always been nonprofit affiliated. 24% mostly came from the private sector, 17% from the public, and 21% had worked in both the public and private sector prior to becoming the leader of a large nonprofit organization in the US. Of our public sector leaders, same kind of concept. 45% were primarily public sector, 16% came out of the private sector, 17% had nonprofit affiliations, and almost a quarter of them had both nonprofit and public affiliations. So that seemed to us to be indicative of an awful lot of leaders having these rich set of multi-sector experiences. We also learned some other interesting things. Women leaders were more likely than men to have cross-sector affiliations.
Right, and we got some insights from some of the women leaders that we interviewed. Now, I will say that we looked at 2,000 leaders. That's the group that you saw. About 200 of them were women. Okay, so think about top leadership in this country, it's about 10%, right? But this is what they said about why affiliations for women were higher no matter whether they were corporate, nonprofit, and public. They said things like, guys have a more straight career bent, okay? They're just more straight line in how they think about things. Women generally have more connections to nonprofit mission. They need more experience to be credible, and so they go on these little zigs and zags in order to get it. They also said that they see life a little differently, because they still, in this country, women still have primary care generally for children. So you're juggling more things, so juggling one more thing might not seem as different to them. We had other women say, women are less likely, this was a woman in a law firm saying, women are less likely to say no, okay? And another person who's the president of a foundation said, you know, we just keep relationships for longer. And her example was that I had interviewed her and hadn't spoken to her in 5 years, right? But she said, but we say yes, because we keep up those relationships.
So we saw a number of archetypes when we looked at these profiles and say, you know, what's the theme? How do you start to pull this together? We saw a number of archetypes, and we'll illustrate them. So the first one was the sector hopper, somebody who had worked in another sector and made a fairly significant change, often to a leadership role in a different sector. Fairly common, you know, to see a corporate person try and make that shift. An example would be, you know, from our database, Mark Tursick. So Mark was a Goldman Sachs managing director based out of New York. He had, under the encouragement of John Whitehead, who was running Goldman Sachs at the time, joined a nonprofit board, eventually joined another nonprofit board, helped them through some turnarounds, and became very interested. At Goldman, he really started to get active in the environmental area and seeing if they could create a line of business around the environmental arena. And Mark was headhunted away to run the Nature Conservancy. So he hopped from the intense world of investment banking to the Nature Conservancy. So that's an archetype you see fairly often. People who have completely shifted their profile.
Right. So I'm going to talk about 3 of them. Down here is the community archetype. And one of our examples for this was Barbara DeSore. She's now at Citigroup, I believe, but was at Bank of America when we interviewed her. And what she said is she'd moved around for her career to different cities in the US a number of times. And the way that she got rooted in a new community was to join different nonprofit boards, to get involved in public commissions. Part of what she really cared about, in addition to the community, or specifically within the community, was education. So I know that she sits on 3 business school boards. You know, she's been involved in lots of educational efforts, but it was all for the purpose of really becoming part of a new community she was living in. Her job wasn't enough. So that's the community leader. Up in the middle, we have the heart. So this is the passion player. This is somebody who has a particular passion for an issue and just goes after it. So Michael Lomax. Sorry, Michael Lomax is president of UNCF. He's been there for a while. Before he was president of UNCF, which is a nonprofit, right, he worked in Georgia, which is his home state, and was an elected official. He's an African-American man. He was an elected official in an all-white district where he ran for public office. Okay. Michael is all about civil rights and getting people to move forward. No matter what he's done, no matter what board he sits on, no matter what his primary job, that's what he's advocating for. That's what he feels most strongly about. Down here, the expert advice. We had a number of these, but one of my favorites is Lisa Caputo, who is at Citigroup? Travelers, thank you. Okay, so Lisa started her career early on in the White House and on Capitol Hill. Her area of expertise was communications. And she was seen as very, very valuable because she understood the workings of regulators and others when she crossed over into a corporate job and became director of marketing. Okay, so she took those skills, that expertise, and moved it over from sector to sector. And finally?
The 5th archetype was the late bloomer. And an example of that is Randy Pond. So Randy's currently the COO, phasing out at Cisco after many successful years at Cisco. As Randy has built up quite a diverse set of affiliations, but we asked him how did this come about? And Randy said, well, I was sitting there fat, dumb, and happy at Cisco, doing just fine, working very hard. I was driving a lot of the M&A program that Cisco was extremely involved in for a number of years. And he said, somebody asked me to serve on a nonprofit board. And I checked with my boss, and he said, sure, go ahead, and we'll try and be helpful. Randy got into it. He really saw, he felt great about the opportunity to learn about the community. He now runs, among other things, he ran all of their community engagement in the whole South Bay to help them think about how, as a corporation, they can be much more involved. It's dramatically affected, if you talk to Randy, how he thinks about his career now going forward, what he's going to do with all the money he's accumulated over time. But it's a late-breaking phenomenon, and that's where we saw a number of these leaders kind of come to it late in life. So we did ask them, so how did your specific path come about? And we really felt we saw two themes to that. The first theme, and it was just striking how many people use the word serendipity to describe their path. They explained it in terms of moves that their network, the people they got to know, who then connected them to opportunities that would otherwise have been invisible to them. So it was network-driven opportunity creation, and then an openness of mind on their part to think about making the switch. The logical component, though, was there was often, to connect those opportunities, there was often a kind of theme. We couldn't quite tell if that was generated before as part of a very strategic effort, or in hindsight as they looked to connect all of those dots. But it might be a drive towards service, desire to give back. It might be a push to broaden expertise, right? So Laura Tyson, PhD in economics from MIT, went in a variety of ways. Rather than going deep, Laura tended to accumulate these ever-broadening set of experiences that really gives her quite a rich and robust understanding of economic theory in practice. There's others, right? People use it to develop talents, to explore a passion. Some of those archetypes give you a good sense of how those dots can be connected. Most of the people we talked to said they never had a career plan, right? They just had a rich network that they continued to develop and some things that they thought were important. So most of these folks that we interviewed and looked at had careers characterized, we would say, by unusual, unpredictable tacks that built on each other in some way to create a new set of opportunities. The image a lot of them would describe was not a career ladder, but a career spiral, where they would end up in these tacks would take them to different ways, always building on each other, always creating, in turn, a new set of opportunities, but ones that they really couldn't predict. So we next asked them about the costs and the benefits of all of these cross-sectoral affiliations. And at a high level, they all said, look, the benefits dramatically exceeded the costs. And we'll talk about both of those. Randy said, look, I became a more mature and skilled executive. It was more of an incremental change. He would describe it in his case. Others, Roger Ferguson, who's the CEO of TIAA-CREF, just comes out and says, these have been transformational for me. I got opportunities I never otherwise would have had by virtue of some of these tacks and the people I met along the way and the skills that I built along the way. So when we asked him about costs and benefit, the costs were a pretty predictable set of stuff. It takes time, you know, early in your career to go serve on a nonprofit board or help out on a political campaign or whatever it might be. That's time that they're pulling away from their day job. A number of them were very straightforward. They said, in hindsight, I probably pulled that time away from my family, from other things, right? But for them, it was important. In some cases, it cost them money narrowly for the job that they were doing. They talked about foregone focus. In a world of breadth versus depth, these are all pretty much people who seem to trade in favor of breadth at the expense of depth and deeper knowledge. It's very interesting as we done some focus group with students here, and they have a mindset which is you really have to go deep and get very, very skilled in a certain topic. Almost none of these leaders would describe it that way. They say when you look at the skills you need X years down the road, it's impossible to predict. So it's the broader, more applicable skills as opposed to the specific technical knowledge that they thought was valuable. And then they also were clear in saying, look, all these transitions, whatever they are, have a cost. Bob Reich described it as coming in and out of the bends, that there's just a transactional cost to making a shift. They all believe, though, that overall it accelerated their career in a very significant way. When we asked about benefits, and we'll go into a bit more detail, they saw them in the three categories of professional, benefit for them in their career, organizational, benefits for the organization they were leading at the time we talked to them, and personal.